Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, the beauty of mathematics, part 52. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. Now, somehow, and I really don't know how, I missed this episode of The Beauty of Mathematics because I normally do it on the first of the month or around the first of the month. Sometimes it'll be the second or the third, or at the latest. But I just completely forgot about it, and I didn't even remember until a few days ago. But I want to get some of the videos out first. So here we are. It's November 16th. By the time you see the video, it'll probably be November 17th. But anyways, better late than never, right? So as of November 16th, the total cryptocurrency market capitalization is 2.982 trillion. The fair value logarithmic regression trend line is now at 3.091 trillion. This still does represent a slight undervaluation of approximately 3.5%. Now, the way this works is that the asset class will spend several years overvalued, it will spend several years undervalued, and that's just the way the market works, right? There's not really necessarily um, a rational way to think about it, I suppose, but if you think about it in terms of just emotion, things can go overvalued for years because of FOMO, and then they can go undervalued for years because of fear. And so, sometimes when you're talking about like what is the fair value of something, and the price is hardly ever at the fair value because when the markets go up, they tend to overshoot, and when they correct, they tend to crash harder than they really have any business crashing. So as you can see throughout the cycles, there's periods of undervaluation and overvaluation, and under and over and under and over and under. And we've been undervalued essentially since the summer of 2022. And there's no guarantee that we will go durably overvalued right now, but you can see that we are approaching that milestone. This has acted as a difficult spot for the asset class to get past really ever since the summer of 2022. So every time we get up to it, we tend to fade, and we're unable to really stay above it. If you look back at the last cycle, we didn't get above it in a durable fashion until November of the halving year, right? So right around now, right? I mean, actually a little bit earlier than now, but right around now, November of the halving year. So if it were to happen this November, then I suppose it would be right on time, especially as compared to last cycle. If you look back further, right? Let's suppose we don't go overvalued. Let's say something happens and we're sitting here in a couple months and we're still undervalued. Then you might want to look back at some of the other cycles and see that that would also be perfectly normal, right? If you look at the 2016, 2017 cycle, you can see that we didn't go overvalued until May or April, May, really May of the post halving year. So that'd be another half a year away, right? Which kind of seems ridiculous at this point, I suppose. But history does show it's possible. If you look at the cycle before that, it took until February of the post halving year. So it would be another 3 months. So I suppose the argument here is that, there's no way to know, first of all, exactly when we will durably go overvalued. It could be tomorrow. It could be half a year away. If it is half a year away, I have to imagine something would interrupt things, right? If you go back and look, there is a pattern that we've talked a little bit about. It's one of those patterns that I don't really think it makes sense to sort of base your entire investment thesis upon it, because the best strategy for the cryptoverse is to DCA blind, sort of without too much thought behind it, right? Just DCA mindlessly for years and years and years, and then at some point you're going to look back and be like, yeah, it was a good decision. And even today, I mean, Bitcoin's just below, it's right around $89,000. So for anyone who's DCA'd Bitcoin for the last couple of years, you're doing pretty well, right? I mean, it's always possible that you have some buys in at higher prices than the current price, but your average entry is likely going to be a lot lower than the current valuation of $89,000. But there is something we've talked a little bit about, and it kind of goes back to not only last cycle, but 2 cycles before that one, where and we really cover this in great detail. So if you followed this channel this year, you will know that back in March we called for a 6 to 9 month drop. 6 to 9 months. Now, the reason I gave a range is because I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know exactly. I never knew how long exactly it would take. I knew that 6 months would be the lower end, 9 months would be sort of the longer time frame. And the reason I gave 6 months was because that's how long it took over here for Bitcoin to break out. And it also had a very similar structure, right? Where it went undervalued and then it went overvalued before rate cuts, right? Undervalued and then overvalued before rate cuts. And then, as those rate cuts came in or got started to get priced in, then the market went back down to being undervalued. Kind of the same thing that happened this cycle. And then it went back up to the fair value, got slightly above it, and then we sold off again. So and this was a pandemic induced recession. So again, this is why you shouldn't base your entire investment thesis upon it. But there are things that could occur where, it might kick the can down the road a few months. That's not entirely out of the question. And so if something like that were to happen, I do think it would set up an opportunity in the cryptoverse. But again, I think the better strategy is to hope for the best, plan for the worst. This is not the only time that pattern has happened. It's one of the main times we've talked about it. But if you actually go back and look at sort of this cycle over here, you can see there's something similar, right? So after the bear market was over, it went overvalued, and then it came back to being undervalued, and then it sort of popped its head slightly above the overvaluation territory, sold off one more time, and because it sold off right there, instead of breaking above the fair value durably in August, it took another half a year. So that's why I'm saying, right? I mean, like, if you just look at last cycle from a cyclical view, now is the time. In fact, there's other elements of confluence right now, not just that. One of the areas, if you go look at, we just did a video on the Fear and Greed Index yesterday, and I mentioned that if it hits 90, that should turn some heads. It hit 90, right? I mean, it's at 90 right now. And so here's the question that I think a lot of us really should think about right now, because it sort of the answer to this question is going to dictate whether you get your alt season in 2025 or if it gets kicked down the road. I'm not saying it won't happen. We probably will get one in 2025. But do you get it in January? Do you get it a few months later? Like, when does it actually start? This might provide the answer to that question. One of the things to remember is that in order to get alt season, which is truly what everyone wants, right? And the reason everyone we know that's what people want is because when the price of Bitcoin goes up, there's a lot of people that don't follow Bitcoin dominance, right? And so like the price of Bitcoin's up and they can look at it and be like, great, like, Bitcoin's at 90K while they're sitting there holding a portfolio of altcoins that haven't done a thing for 3 years. So it's one of those things where the only way to really get alt season is to stay euphoric for more than a couple of days. Okay? What do I mean by that? Well, if you look, and again, the reason I'm talking about this is because it will help us figure out if we're going to durably go overvalued now, immediately, and follow the cyclical view of Bitcoin, which we'll talk about, or if we have to kick the can down the road. So one of the things to remember, and this goes back to what happened back over here in March of 2024, if you guys remember, Bitcoin went to the 90 to 100 level in terms of fear and greed. It went into the 90s. And back in March, if you guys go back and watch sort of the prevailing views of YouTube at the time, everyone was calling, for a major breakout, right? To much, much higher prices, right? To 100K, to 200K, so on and so forth. Because they were looking at this and thinking that the Fear and Greed Index hitting the 90s was going to repeat exactly what it did in November of 2020. Because the last time, what brought them to the Cryptoverse was that rally, right? There's probably a lot of people here that joined crypto in late 2020, early 2021, specifically because of this rally. And that is ultimately what led to alt season, because it brought a lot of eyes back to the cryptoverse. That's why during this rally, after Bitcoin was done rallying, you had alt season, because tons of new eyeballs came to the space and they weren't going to buy Bitcoin. They wanted to go buy the shiny objects, which were in fact the altcoins. So back in March, when Bitcoin hit this fear and greed index in the 90s and everyone was thinking that it was this, I said, guys, hold on a second, right? Let's not get ahead of ourselves. What if it's this? What if it's the 2019 style top, where Bitcoin goes into the 90s, but it only stays there for a few days, right? If it only stays there for a few days, it's not going to lead to the same level of euphoria that you're expecting. And if it doesn't lead to the same level of euphoria, then that means that Bitcoin dominance is not done going up. So if you go look at Bitcoin USD and you overlay Bitcoin dominance, if you're new to the channel, I got some news for you. We talk about Bitcoin dominance a little bit around here. We probably won't forever, but if you look at it, right, back in March, dominance back then was at 53% or so. Today, dominance is at 60%. So what happened was that Bitcoin got euphoric, right? It got euphoric, but it wasn't enough to really bring people back. That was the issue. It wasn't enough to really make people come back to the table and say, all right, what's going on in crypto? It made headlines for sure. I mean, a lot of people were talking about Bitcoin when it was back at 73K, but it didn't bring the masses back. How do we know it didn't bring the masses back? Because you could argue that maybe the masses did come back, and they just bought Bitcoin and they didn't buy alts. Well, the reason we know that is if you go look at YouTube views to, I got about, I don't know, like 25 different crypto YouTube channels on here. If you go back and look at March, what you'll notice is that there was a surge in views, but then the minute Bitcoin topped, right? The minute it hit its top, the views just died off, right? Whereas in 2020 and 2021, after Bitcoin hit its top, we continued to see views surge, even after Bitcoin slowed down. Here, we didn't even know that March was the top. Well, we had a pretty good theory on this channel that it was, because it corresponded with gold breaking out and USDT dominance hitting its long-term trend line. So over here, we were like, hey guys, this might be the top for the next 6 to 9 months. And it was. But you can see that immediately after Bitcoin cooled off, the views plummeted. I mean, and we went up to about 2 million views collectively. But then, that was in March. By April, we were back down to 1 million views a day in terms of all these channels combined, 1 million views a day. So that is the question, right? Does it durably bring people back, or does it not? So if Bitcoin keeps rallying, for several weeks, kind of like what it did in 2020, then it would likely lead to the fear and greed index staying in extreme greed for longer, right? And the longer it's there, the more people are going to come back to the cryptoverse. But if Bitcoin kind of fades or doesn't make that move to 100K like we all want it to, then the sort of the fear and greed could start to go back down. Now, at the end of the day, when you look at sort of the ROI from the cycle low, we've covered this extensively for this cycle. One of the reasons I didn't think we would go up and beyond March was we were also so far ahead of the prior cycles, right? I mean, it looked like we needed to cool off for about half a year, just visually, right? I mean, forget about gold and USDT dominance, right? I mean, just looking at the chart, the ROI from the low was so much above the other two cycles. We were at 4.6x off the low, whereas the two cycles before that were only at 2 to 3x off the low from that point in the cycle. But now, because Bitcoin cooled off for half a year, now you can see it's more in line with the prior cycles. So I would argue that Bitcoin has a better chance of sustaining it now than it did back at 73K. It has a better chance because the ROI is back in line with the last 2 cycles. So I think we go into it thinking this could lead to a longer term period where the fear and greed index stays at 90 and above. The one thing to consider, if it does end up fading and it doesn't really lead to a durable breakout, and let's say it does what it did last cycle or what it did 2 cycles before that, where it gets another sell-off or something, I suppose the reason in hindsight would just simply be that we're still in QT and not in QE. That might be the reason. But again, the transition from QT to QE could occur anytime. I mean, maybe the Fed will pivot in December. So I think that's kind of where we are right now. I think it makes sense to look at a chart like this, and we've been talking about it for years, right? For me personally, I've said stay Bitcoin heavy until 60% dominance. Now that we're at 60% dominance, I certainly think it makes sense to hedge, but there's one sort of reality to sort of everything going on as it relates to Bitcoin dominance. And I've struggled with this for a long time because I told you guys my target was 60% for years, at least, right? I mean, I've said it could go higher, and now it already has, right? It's already gone to 61%. And, I look at it and I'm like, well, how do we figure out where the top is for something like dominance, right? How do we know like what's going to actually bring people back? The thing that happened last cycle that led to the change and what really led to alt season, and it wasn't just price, right? That's the thing. I think everyone assumes that the price has to go up for people to become interested, and that seems logical, right? And that seems like the rational way to think about the market, but there is some evidence against it. If you were to go look at the social risk, right? This tracks not only YouTube views, but subs to YouTube channels, and then followers to different crypto analysts on Twitter or X and exchanges and layer ones. You can see actually that in 2019, the social risk started going up here, right? It was forming higher lows even while Bitcoin was going down, right? And even when Bitcoin had this crash, it was still forming higher lows. What happened here, right? What happened in 2019 that sort of led to that higher low structure on the social risk? We haven't yet seen that this cycle. Now, we just had a big surge in the social risk, which is great to see. This is the first higher high we've had in a long time in the social risk, right? I mean, we had higher highs, back over here, but we haven't had any higher highs on the social risk in any time recently. And hopefully it goes back up to the higher levels, but there's also no guarantee that, that the masses will immediately come back. Right? Hope for the best, plan for the worst. And again, the social risk was just putting in, basically, it was back at zero just a week or two ago. What's interesting is every time it hits zero or gets close to it has historically been a time where altcoins start to catch at least a bid, even if they still underperform Bitcoin. But what happened, in sort of this September of 2019 that led to the higher low structure on social risk, no matter what the price did? That's the key thing, right? It didn't matter what price was doing. Social risk was trending higher. I think, and again, it's dubious speculation. I absolutely could be wrong. Absolutely. But I think what it was the pivot from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. And also looser monetary policy in general, right? We did have rate cuts. So I think that's what happened. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that had some effect on it, because it was precisely when the Fed began QE. That's exactly where Bitcoin dominance topped out last cycle. Right? Exactly. I mean, if you look at the Bitcoin dominance top, it was right when the Fed pivoted from QT, quantitative tightening, to QE. And I think the reason why Bitcoin dominance continues to go higher, and you see things like ETH just stuck in traffic on Struggle Street, and no matter what Bitcoin does, ETH underperforms it. You would be interested to know, perhaps, that this past week, Bitcoin is up 11.5%. Would you care to guess how much ETH is up? It's down 4%. This is what I remember seeing in 2016, right? And this is why I was not very optimistic on ETH. I'm like, well, look, if Bitcoin goes up, it'll lift ETH with it, but ETH Bitcoin likely goes down until QE returns. That doesn't mean ETH can't rally, right? I mean, there's been a lot of altcoins rallying recently, so I'm not suggesting that it can't catch a bid. It's just that you see why the underperformance is continuing. It's because we haven't really yet had the durable higher low and higher high structure on the social risk where people come back to the table and they say, I want to invest in crypto and I want to see what's happening in the cryptoverse. We haven't seen that transition. It's possible it's beginning, but it's not obvious yet, right? We've seen spikes before that ultimately just came right back down. So believe it or not, I mean, like, I do run a YouTube channel, as you know, right? You're here watching it. I would love nothing more than for people to come back and watch the cryptoverse like they used to. But it just hasn't been like that since 2021. Every spike in the interest eventually faded. Maybe this time is different. Maybe there's something to sort of there's obviously discussions about the strategic reserve. There's obviously more discussions about, what's going to go on with, more of the institutions getting involved and whatnot. But at the end of the day, we got to go with the numbers, right? And, what do the numbers say right now? We are potentially looking at our first higher high in a while. Can it put in a higher low? My guess is if the Fed pivots to QE, it'll put in a higher low. So we'll see, hopefully. So when we go back to sort of that chart we were looking at earlier, can we go durably overvalued here? I think it depends on how long Bitcoin can stay sort of in the euphoric stage, right? I mean, I think everyone feels it right now. Everyone's kind of got that feeling in their stomach of like, what's going to happen tomorrow. Kind of like it was in March, right? When we hit extreme greed. The key thing about fear and greed index, I have to remind people, is that it's not really a great indicator to sort of buy and sell by itself, because like sometimes it'll go up to these levels, and if you sell, it ends up marking the top, like in 2019 and in March 2024. But then other times it goes up here, and if you sold when it hit 90, then you missed out on a great move that came right after it. So I don't think you should look at the fear and greed index as a reason to sort of buy and sell crypto, but it can give you confluence, right? I also think maybe it's more worthwhile to look at, say, like a 30-day EMA or something, right? If it's spending a lot of time up here, then it's more indicative of like things are way too heated and the market needs to cool off. Whereas if it's just up here for, a little bit, then it would imply that the market, could certainly go higher. So I think where I stand right now on this stuff as it relates to sort of the total market cap and trend line, I think it makes sense to be open-minded to what happened here in November, where, it got above it and then it just kept on going. That was during QE, and we had seen sort of that durable higher low structure on the social risk, which we're not yet seeing. So, but it's still possible that could play out. And the reason I would say it's more possible today than it was back over here, 7-8 months ago, is because we're further along in the cycle, and the cyclical ROI is more in line with the prior cycles than we were back in March, at least when you measure it from the low. Now, if you do measure it from the peak, right, if you go peak to peak, you can actually see that it's following last cycle right now, right? I mean, it's almost, it started moving up the minute the last cycle sort of caught up with it. You see that? So I've been following that a lot recently to see if it can continue to follow it, because this is exactly when that rally happened, right? Last cycle. And you can see that Bitcoin's trying to follow suit. If it falls off for whatever reason, just know that I feel like there's a safety net below in terms of the cycle that was before that one, right? I mean, it's still, at this point in the cycle, the ROI from the peak to peak back then, Bitcoin was still 30% below the all-time high. So there's definitely a lot of ways to look at the market, but I just think that when you're sort of looking at this total market cap and trend line, when we're trying to figure out, is it time to durably go overvalued? Is it time to go undervalued? I think a lot of it's going to depend on how long Bitcoin can stay sort of in this euphoric range. where it's between 90 to 100. If it can stay here for more than a day or two, so if it's different than 2019 and if it's different than March, if it can stay here for a few weeks, then it would favor an alt season, especially in, say, like early 2025. But if it only stays here for a couple days and then the market kind of cools off again, then we're just going to be kicking the can down the road again, kind of like we did last cycle and the cycle before that. It doesn't mean we're not going to go overvalued again. I'm sure we would, but it might just take it another few months to get there. So yeah, I mean, I think that's where we are. I do think that, I mean, in general, you can see that the main areas of accumulation are sort of when the asset class is below the fair value logarithmic regression trend line, this red line, which we've been below for a number of years now. I have been very critical of the altcoin market for the last few years because I just said that, like, you know, usually during this time down here, there's a rotation of capital from altcoins to Bitcoin, which honestly, you know, it wasn't something that people were really fond of that idea. But I hope that you can look back today and kind of understand where I was coming from, right? You look back at the chart now and it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, you see that the Bitcoin dominance has just been going up the entire time. So hopefully you understand like why I was so, you know, sort of strong, you know, very strong opinion about that view that, you know, it's better to stick with Bitcoin until, you know, until 60% dominance at the very least, because all that money is just going to go into Bitcoin and that's what's going to fuel the rally, right? Altcoins typically don't run until after Bitcoin dominance is topped. And we haven't really seen that yet, right? We haven't seen the evidence just yet that Bitcoin dominance has topped. It's possible that it has. I mean, it's definitely hit my target, but in terms of QE, you know, we haven't seen that yet. And the other thing too, from the cyclical point of view, if Bitcoin can rally into the end of the year, let's say it does follow what it did last cycle, where it just sort of rallies on up at the end of November and December, then this pullback that we got by dominance is potentially this one right here that also occurred in November. You know, it's probably better viewed on alt Bitcoin pairs, right? If you look at alt Bitcoin pairs, you can see that in mid-November, alt Bitcoin pairs got a 2-week rally. And you can see right here, you know, alt Bitcoin pairs have been, you know, sort of doing okay for the last couple of weeks. I still think there is a good chance that Bitcoin will suck the liquidity from the altcoin market one last time for this cycle. And my guess, if it's going to happen, is it's going to happen in December. That's my guess, is if Bitcoin is going to suck that liquidity out of the altcoin market one more time, I think it'll be December. And then, you know, if that happens, then we really get to connect the dots, just like last cycle. You know, where you get your first tag of the trend line in the bear market, and then you get your second tag of the trend line, you know, right here, just before the Fed pauses rates. Right here, just before the Fed pauses rates, this blue line. And then you get your third tag of the trend line as rate cuts begin. And if that happens again, then you'll get your third tag of the trend line down here for alt Bitcoin pairs. If you're new here, which some of you are, remember alt Bitcoin pairs are not the same as alt USD pairs. Alt Bitcoin pairs can go down while alt USD pairs go up. It's also possible that alt Bitcoin pairs go down while alt USD pairs go down. It just depends on Bitcoin. And that's why I've said for the last few years, right, like, if you want exposure to crypto, one of the best things to do is just get Bitcoin, because it gives you exposure to the upside, but it also minimizes your downside risk. So you're not just stuck here several years later watching your altcoin, sorry, not your altcoin, everyone else's altcoin bleed, right? Your altcoin, I'm sure, is fine. But, you know, that way you're not sitting here 3 years later watching your friend's altcoin bleed for having bled for 3 years, and then they're like, crap, I should have just stuck with Bitcoin. And that would have preserved the Satoshi valuation of my portfolio. So I guess a lot of this sort of depends on, is the move, first of all, I don't know if there's going to be a move or not. I think it's going to happen, right? Is the move down here by alt Bitcoin pairs, is it on a rally or is it on a dump? The cyclical view has continued to prevail, right? And I've said before, markets do not need a reason to go up. Markets generally trend up. They need a reason to go down. So until you see that reason to go down, it has historically made sense to defer to the cyclical view. So I think you defer to that. If the market starts to show us something else and Bitcoin starts to struggle then it could be, it could be on a downturn. And then if it is on a downturn, I still think we would eventually go overvalued. It just might kick the can down the road 6 months. So I think a lot of it depends on, about like when alt season, when durably overvalued, like, when is this going to go durably overvalued and go into alt season. A lot of that depends on the answer to this question, right? Is the final move down by alt Bitcoin pairs, is it on a Bitcoin rally following the sort of the cyclical view of Bitcoin, right? ROI from the cycle low matches right now, right? This is when it normally goes up. Or is it going to follow something else, right? Which is what happened last cycle, where where Bitcoin got the breakout. It got the breakout right there, and then it fell one last time, and then we still went durably overvalued, right? It's just that we got one more shakeout before that actually happened. So it might actually be really interesting to see what happens in the next couple of weeks. I do think there's a chance that Bitcoin might cool off a little bit, like it normally does, going into the beginning of the month. If you guys remember, Bitcoin's been doing that thing where like every time it rallies, it then kind of stalls out about, halfway through the month, 3 weeks through the month, and then it kind of waits for the labor market data to come in. We've seen that a lot. We saw it right here in early April, and then again in early June, and then again in early August. And then it happened again here. We said it's likely going to stall out for a little bit right here. Wait for the labor market data to come in. If the unemployment rate comes in low, at 4.1% or lower, then the cyclical view will likely prevail and it'll rally. And you can see that it has. It's gotten a 2-week rally. If it does stall out, it's just going to be because it's waiting for the labor market data that'll come in a couple of weeks. So my guess is that we should get the answer to all of these questions about alt Bitcoin pairs and all that stuff. And, is it time to go durably override? We should get that answer in about 2 to 3 weeks, right? 2 to 3 weeks. If in 2 to 3 weeks the unemployment rate is still low and it isn't showing any concerning signs, then it was probably more likely that the market trends higher. If it shows concerning signs, then yeah, it's possible we get one last drop before going durably overvalued. But that's where I think, that's what I think about the current market outlook, and how it sort of relates to the prior cycles. And, again, right now we're about 3% undervalued. And I think that might not make sense to a lot of people. But, the idea is that the asset class grows as a function of time. Like more and more people come in. So, in 2021, the fair value was only 700 billion when we were at 3 trillion market cap, which is where we are today. Now we're at 3 trillion market cap, but the fair value is also 3 trillion. So even though the market cap is the same as it was back over here, we're not as overvalued as we were back over there. And if you take the percent difference between the total market cap and the fair value, you get a chart that looks like this, right? So this way you can kind of see what I'm talking about, how there were 2 cycles where we sort of had one rally above the fair value, above the red line, and then back down. And then we poked our head back above it, and then back down once more, and then off to the races, right? And then 2 cycles ago, we went above it, and back down, went back above it, back down, and then off to the races. It was the 2016-2017 cycle that doesn't look like that at all, right? That was the one where we just kind of stayed way down here for a really long time, and then we didn't really start moving until the post-halving year, at least as it relates to the extension off the fair value. So we'll see what happens this cycle, but I just wanted you guys to see kind of all the possibilities here and to be prepared for both outcomes, because I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't claim to know what's going to happen. I just want to present to you the, sort of the outlook on the market, and to know that if it is following one view, then to defer to that view until proven otherwise. The thing that I've learned the most over the last few years, and even before starting the YouTube channel, is that TA, it's great, but a lot of times it fails. The thing that works the most is momentum. Momentum. That's a lot. It goes for a lot. And that's the thing, like, when the market's turning up, it doesn't matter what your TA says. As long as you end the TA analysis with, and then the price of Bitcoin should go up, you're going to be right more often than not. If the market's turning down, it doesn't matter what your TA is. As long as you end the video with, and that's why I think it's going to go down, then people will think that your TA is good and useful. But at the end of the day, I think momentum is probably one of the most powerful things in the market. And so I think you try to ride the momentum as long as you can. If it does give you any indication that it is sort of stalling out, then it makes sense to reconsider. But at least in the short term, we just had 2 pretty great weeks with Bitcoin, right? We had a 17% move up and then a 12% move up, at least so far. So we'll see where the end of the week comes in. We'll obviously keep providing updates to this stuff. Thank you guys for tuning in. Hopefully you enjoyed this installment of Bitcoin, the beauty of mathematics. And of course, the obvious goal, I know we're at 3 trillion now. The obvious goal is to get to 10 trillion, plus or minus a few trillion. As we go to sleep at night, we cannot help but wonder, what's a few $1 trillion among friends? Thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye.